Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings of peace, mercy, and blessings to you all. This is Chris with Just Us, Building Restorative Community. Sitting here with a coworker, a community member, somebody who I definitely look up to. I've had limited interactions so far with you, but limited in number, but definitely quality is limitless. But I'm sitting here with Becky. Becky, introduce yourself. What's going on?
Sure.
Who are you?
Yeah. So my full name is Rebecca Elizabeth McCammon, which is 26 letters, and I go by Becky. And on AHN is my Korean last name, and so my babies also have that as a second middle name. So that's our sort of binding piece. And McCammon is the family name of the family that adopted me from Korea.
Okay.
So, a handful of people who I have thoughtful affection for refer to me as Rebecca, and I just never, in any of our development of relationship, corrected. So to some people I am thoughtfully Rebecca, and then if folks slip into Rebecca that I'm in pretty regular email correspondence with, I know that they're not reading to the bottom of my emails because
Emails tell everything nowadays.
Because I'm pretty intentional about all opening and all closing of exchanges with other human beings to make those as relational as possible, even though it's about send and open and things like that.
It's amazing how those little cues make such a big difference. And I've only met one other person who's like as intentional as you are with it. and it actually was a point of confusion and contention with him. So I've noticed that you are intentional about that.
There was a brief moment in my history where it looked like I would marry my kiddo's dad, and his last name is Beck, and so then I would have been Becky Beck, which would have been really hip.
That is a cool name.
But we didn't do that, so I did not go down that path. Also, I think I have always been in growing relationship with my name, and so I could stand to use a few more years getting acclimated to what McCammon means and whatnot. And I don't have a great cursive B. I've never had a good cursive B, so it's enough that I when I sign my name on things, I still use Rebecca because I feel confident in the R. So, who am I? I'm 43 and enjoying that. I'm feeling okay. I feel like this feels like the sweet spot of not feeling anxious about the beginning of 40s. Like that was a false, you're still young. No, I'm just embracing. Like I have a lot more white hair coming in. And yesterday I spent time with a Korean adoptee who's a photojournalist. And so she's doing a project where she's meeting and interviewing other Korean adoptees, and she was really specific in her invitation that she didn't need any more millennials, and so I'm like, no, I'm good, solidly way past that. Just the way you can feel the texture of story with somebody who, she's 25 and I'm 43, and she is all kinds of brilliant and loving and wise and just so exactly where she is. And I feel grateful and humble and good about being 43. I don't need to rewind to any other spaces. I would take the metabolism. Back of 25.
That would be nice.
But otherwise,
I would take the energy of 25.
I don't even know if I could calculate what the energy of 25 was.
I remember being able to just go and not worry about being tired.
Oh.
And now I'm 36. So I haven't reached 40 yet, but now I definitely feel the need for rest, and I don't remember feeling the need for rest in those years.
Interesting.
But it's amazing how I needed different things back then, and so.
One really wise woman, she's in her 50s now, and she described the 40s as sort of the it 40s, where you just come to embrace and release. And then she said the 50s are the you 50s, like where you really you've embraced yourself and you're letting go of the weight of other people's rubrics for you. And so then maybe you can just step into some casual anger and you-ness in your 50s. Go. So we'll see what that sounds like.
Let me know when you get there.
Okay, I will. I don't want to race there because that will mean that my babies are Whew. Oh God, Quinn would be 20. So I have a 13-year-old boy.
Okay.
And 7 years from now, if I'm 50, he's 20. And that means that hopefully over the next 7 years, I've had a lot of uncomfortable and awkward and glorious conversations about coming of age as a young man between 13 and 20. And my daughter, who is 9, was 16.
Oof.
Right? Does that sound like I did accurate math?
Yeah, that does.
And that'll be 2 years into her solo, right, as the only kid at home, because theoretically Quinn will aspire after he's 18 to have a different kind of residence and learning space. Maybe. We'll see.
That is a possibility. that is the American trajectory.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
I've learned how amazingly different that is in different cultures.
Yeah.
I've come across, my wife is Pakistani, and in her culture, especially the males, but particularly the older males, like it's almost expected that they stay in a family household to become the head of the households and take care of their parents, but while bringing in their wife and their children.
Interesting.
And I've seen that actually in practice in Pakistan with one of her uncles, but I've seen it in the American context where sort of these Pakistani American young men don't want to fulfill that cultural expectation, and so the families buy these big homes thinking that their male children will bring their family into it, and all of a sudden they find themselves by themselves in the house, and it's like, oh no, they did the thing of where they just leave the house once they're old enough. So yeah, it looks so different in different cultures, and I'm always amazed by what is the expectation. It seems like you're open to possibilities.
I think I have a lot of empathy for these different phases of when do we matter and who do we matter to. You know, as long as my children aren't listening to this and none of their peer group are listening to this, my kiddos were, and one of them still is, co-sleepers. And that was not in any of the baby books like a chapter that I was like, well, this looks like a great idea. Let's do this, except that then it does happen. And they I mean, she's 9, and so that's how I know what it is to go to sleep when your heartbeat matches. And that's what you talked a little bit ago of sense of safety and sense of readiness. And so I don't have much experience being physically far away from my kiddos at night, right? So in terms of like what conditions or what the what ifs of what could happen during the evening of a fire or an emergency, or you've got to get out, like I've never been further away than this length of couch from my kiddos, for better or worse. And I don't think I didn't sleep well for many, many, many years, sort of lovingly sandwiched between these dear bodies, but that's how we regulate at the end of the day. So this idea that somehow he'll go to college or he'll go off to some experience and like that sharing of breath won't be so close, like I can't imagine. And I've watched my mother and I've watched other grandparents go through this torrential sort of grief cycle of, I so want to matter to my grandchildren. I so want to still matter to my children. And how am I relevant? How do I fit into their lives in any way? So I know I've watched my mom make concessions to fit into, to plug into, right? She doesn't want to miss any potential moment. But in the scope of raising kids and working full time and doing all of that, I'm not always as mindful of that journey for her to matter, to feel important. It's hard
when you get caught in the middle of relationships. It's fulfilling your duty as a daughter, as a son, but at the same time fulfilling your duties as a mother or as a father. I've struggled with, and I see it play out in my family. We've always been very close, and I think the hardest part is has never been the physical space, not being able to share, have moments of honesty and of sharing. So it's like I can be far away, and it's not the distance that gets me. It's the being able to sit with my grandmother and have a cup of coffee and her tell me a story. Or with that same experience, my mother at the other end of the table, and us sitting there and just talking and complaining about whatever happened in the day. That was our circle time growing up. It was always at the coffee table. So it's that I miss.
Okay.
And so now it's like I had to move to Minnesota from Florida. to fulfill my professional duties, in order to fulfill my fatherly and husbandly duties of, hey, I need a job that pays me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I loop that to what we're talking about, the duties of relationship. It's not being able to share space to fulfill my duties as a son, and being the eldest son. It tears me apart, and it's like, well, how do I balance this out? And there is no right or wrong answer, right? Like,
Right.
we kind of just figure it out day by day.
Yeah, I'm the oldest, and I have two younger brothers. My middle brother is also adopted as a white man, and my youngest brother was the I guess we can't have babies. So both white men, and both really on paper successful. So one is a doctor and one's a chief financial officer, and so we have an interesting sort of dynamic of they make tons more money than I do.
Doctor and CFO, yeah.
Yeah, and it, you know, those titles are wrapped up in white male privilege.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And varying amounts of consciousness. And so the joke, probably over the last decade, you know, has been that Matt will be the person who makes all sort of the medical choices, and Chris will cover all the financial decisions, and I will show up and have food. Right, the emotional labor of these various experiences, like, and that's an interest. Like, it's not quite a foil, but it's a different model than what you've experienced as the oldest male.
Yeah.
As the oldest female. So listening to you talk about what listening felt like in your family growing up, I had a really different sense of that. For me, growing up in a white family, there is a really consistent expectation of good, or expectation of being well behaved, because at any moment a parent could say to you that, like, this isn't really working out and we regret that we made this choice, or we could send you back, or some fleeting impermanence about not having
Wow.
a blood relationship, which is not rational, certainly, but I think there's lots of flavors to what I now as an adult understand about reactive attachment. And I don't like to put the last D on it, because disorder to me has some messiness to it, but strains of relationship because of how your life began, whether that was life in an orphanage or foster care or whatnot. And so I can remember my grandmother's spaces really, really clearly, but I remember listening to make sure that I was fulfilling the role, as opposed to listening for the fabric of their lives. Like, they're bits and pieces, but I don't remember listening then the way I feel like I'm privileged to listen in circle.
You're giving me a lot to think about right now.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. No, like, you've given me a lot to think about with regards to my own relationship with people in my family. Sort of the same situations that I haven't really thought about, perhaps what it is, how it is that they approach attachment, and where they sit with it. Because I could definitely see maybe their experiences, without a doubt, I could see their previous experiences growing up having an influence on how they relate to me. So circle.
Yeah.
How long have you been? What's that?
Yeah, I have been on the most remarkable and gifted and saturated circle story for the last 3 years. So in 2015, St. Paul Federation of Then Teachers, now educators, were bargaining for the schools our children deserve in St. Paul Public Schools, and restorative practices was one of the things that they were bargaining for. And I was on the bargaining team at that point, and so the bargaining team had the opportunity to share space and time with a whole bunch of circle keepers and lovely people before we were going to the table. And absurdly, I can look back on it now and it's completely absurd, but absurdly, we were literally around tables in a rectangle, and there was very, very little equity of voice, and it was all time in our heads as opposed to time in our hearts. And I can remember sitting across from Sharon Combs-Bradley and watching her posture and sort of the graceful way she listened with such patience to this cacophony of, like, dominant white voices, and, like, so how do we explain it at the bargaining table? And Jamie Williams to my right, in the way that she leans over with a lot of love when she's leaning in, even if all energies are doing something else. To talk about the restorative practices was a way of being. So at the bargaining table, what we won, and I'm air quoting that, and that's meaningful, was that St. Paul Public Schools would dedicate $4.5 million over 3 years towards 12 restorative practice pilot sites, spaces of much learning over 3 years. So 6 schools in the first year, 3 to be added the second, and 3 in the third year. And what they partnered that to was that the National Education Association, at that time we had applied for a Great Public Schools grant, and then we won that grant. What it meant was that the union paid for what would become my job as the restorative practice program coordinator, and the district paid for the other half. And on the union side, it meant that I had this allowance of grant money to work with community circle keepers to develop circle experiences for educators, so that folks in St. Paul, it wouldn't be cost prohibitive, that we could just offer and include and welcome. And so I was hired in the summer of 2016, and I didn't know what I didn't know. I was an English teacher for 14 years, mostly in high school, mostly in an alternative creative arts school, and my last 3 years in a middle school. And I coached educators for 2 years, and during that 2 years I spent an intense amount of time readying myself and readying my practice and personhood to facilitate Beyond Diversity, which is a really intense 2-day racial equity training.
Yeah.
And so that was what I was fixtured with. And that summer I had lots of experience in the classroom, and I believe I was a deeply relational educator, and lots of intentional and difficult and good work in racial equity and my own racial autobiography. And I had spent some time beginning to understand and love and care about how to be collaborative and co-learners with adults who are just as dynamic and unique and needy as 5-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 19-year-olds.
I find sometimes more so.
Uh-huh.
I'll say it for you. I was once a teacher as well, and yeah, we're a special type of people once we get in those roles.
I feel like there's just so much unmet need.
Yeah, I absolutely agree
nothing
with you
about
there.
public education, and very, very little about beyond, your K-12 experience ever attends to the vibrance and the variety in which we're designed to learn and take in information. And I barely made it through, or it felt like barely made it through an English major that was suffocatingly white, and I didn't have the language then to even understand what was choking me, but it was. In August, in 2016, I scheduled some time with, or maybe they even wanted to hang out with me. Kate Pranis and Jeannie Zimmer wanted to hang out, and I'm super grateful that I didn't Google anybody before that, because then I would have really, all of my model minority overachieving tendencies would have kicked in if I had Googled Kate beforehand. And they were loving and gracious and welcoming and kind. So when your job is specifically build something, that's what we've been doing since then. I sit in lots and lots and lots and lots of circles, and sat in lots and lots of circles with the likes of Kate and Jeannie and Raj and Sharon and Dominique, and I'm super, super, super spoiled. Cheryl and Aura in Chicago, who've been holding circles there for years. I think they describe themselves as recovering lawyers who took up restorative justice in Chicago. And yes, I don't even know. There's about 1 million different stories and circles and centerpieces and values bound up in the last 3-ish years.
That does sound amazing.
It's super spoiled.
I share part of that experience, so I could definitely relate. Yeah, it's definitely spoiling up here. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Just Us right after this. We're back with more Just Us. If you're just joining us this week, I'm talking to Becky about circle, about restorative practices, about just being us, being who she is, being who I am, and kind of how we move forward in this world. Becky, you were telling us a little bit about kind of how your circle work with St. Paul Public Schools started, and even how it's so much related to your personal upbringing. I don't know if intentionally, unintentionally, or intentionally, unintentionally, you were able to talk about that idea of white spaces and being choked out with, I don't know,
Chaucer, Shakespeare.
Yeah, about like a white, like this whiteness in these spaces, and especially in education, and stepping into spaces that actually did bring voices of color up.
Yeah.
And even just, not just voices of color, but just different voices. Is that where you got introduced to Circle, in the development of those?
Yeah. So the opening months were surreal in that you have, for somebody who body like anxiousness around imposter syndrome on a really regular basis, and then so to be in a role where I've had no restorative practice training. I'm coming as thoughtfully and as humbly as possible into a space, but I'm sitting across from Nancy Riestenberg at Dunn Brothers in Roseville, and she's been in it for 20 years, and Kate Prentice. I mean, Minnesota is saturated with legacy circle keepers.
Yeah.
And and then there's me, and
can I just tell you, I mean, I know it'll never change the way you feel, but I would have never, I don't know enough about you to know that was the case. I would have never been able to guess that. Because anytime I've shared space with you, whether it was in Circle, even just sharing space in a meeting, you are what Circle is supposed to be, and it's being relational and just allowing us to connect as people. And you've never been anything other than that. So my mind is blown right now that is the case. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah. So I think that nearly 10 years ago, I was taking part in an absent narratives cohort at the Minnesota Humanities Center. In that experience, we did a lot of work with sacred spaces in Minnesota and Bedote experiences and unlearning, right, and learning simultaneous. And I grew up in Minnesota, and the scope of what I didn't know and was never offered up, and the scope of what I still need to know. I think Raj says it well, that the single truth that he can wake up to every day is that his feet step onto stolen land. So in that space, I was introduced to the Indigenous Story Circle. So the line begins in the center and moves outward, right? So there's a constancy of circle. And I had just spent the last at least 10 years teaching the plot chart to young people, right? So there's rising action, and characters have conflict, and up the hill we go, and then there's some sort of conflict or climax, and then there's the denouement, there's resolution. And for as long as I taught that, young people are pointing out the inconsistency or the inaccuracy or how this doesn't fit. The story doesn't fit, it doesn't match up. And I always have to concede, you're right, there are these nuances to where this doesn't match. But I had never been presented with, nor imagined, what the alternate frame could be. So I immediately, right, sort of fell in English teacher and personhood love with the Indigenous Story Circle, and it supports me to have grace around the origins of our story in St. Paul with restorative practices. Because at the same time that I was brand new, right, in this particular role and title, we had 6 schools that were beginning, and while some of their folks were not brand new to Circle, some people were. And we sat in Circle every month together for like 10 hours to talk about, when you're the only circle keeper in a school, or where you're one of 2 in a school, how do you possibly translate a symphony into the individual parts and pieces and rhythms and intonations and pacing? Like, so we sat in lots and lots of circles together. I think there is genuine beauty in my origin and the St. Paul origin, because when an educator approaches and says, I feel like I've been doing this forever, or that finally describes who I am or what I was about, maybe I wasn't doing it like just this way, I feel like I can affirm them from a really, really, really honest place of that there isn't a certificate, and there isn't a licensure, and there isn't a sure, true, and certainly not the plot chart path to finding a way into restorative work. Like
that resonates with me so much, and it coming up here to Minnesota a couple years ago, and finally falling eventually, what didn't happen at first, but eventually falling into those conversations of certificates and all these colonized approaches to our practices. I took it very much to heart because it was an experience of my own, that having been in grad school and written papers on restorative justice, I spoke with an authority thinking that I knew what I was talking about, and one that I took for granted, and to come up here to Minnesota and sit in circle and to start sinking into this world. And it's a sinking, but I mean immersion, but lifting my soul up at the same time, coming to the humble conclusion that how dare you write a paper or papers thinking you knew what this was. Like, I that's what I told myself. I'm like, no, like, this is not something that's picked up from a book. This is not something that's picked up from videos or training, or this is something you pick up from being in relationships. And so, like, what you're saying really hits me hard, because it's the one thing that I turn to, and the teachers when I'm with them. Listen, there's no certificate. There's none of that. But more importantly, like, I'm not asking you to do anything different. I'm just saying, take a look back, and what you do best is relating to people, and just do that. I'm just helping you do that. Yeah. So I'm really amazed by what you're saying right now.
And there are important tensions with that, right? Like, so in year one, fortune and instinct and heart impulse guided all of the respective principals to hire who they hired. And so everyone who arrives came with a very different story, the one that you fit on paper and the one that you carry around in your heart. And so that meant that people were making different amounts of money while doing the same intensity of heart work and head work. We had to, in year one, between the union and the district, sort of create job descriptions, right, for all of the roles. And that feels, of course, and is colonized because there are bargaining units, because there are job descriptions, and because there are pay scales. And we didn't want the restorative practice circle keepers and leaders to be pushed aside or bumped by a behavior specialist, intervention specialist, cultural specialist, because the work of imagining how something as sacred as circle and restorative work, how that can be part of a whole school implementation plan. Like, I think we're constantly, we have to hold ourselves deeply, deeply, deeply accountable to building something of indigenous origin in a colonized space. Like, how do you approach those conflicts in a way that's really, really relational? Yeah. So it's complicated. It's
messy.
it's messy, and I know, because the journey has privileged me to be in lots of different spaces around the country, that you have really, really loving English teachers that point two of their life is to be the restorative practice person for the building, right? Or that in a gigantic urban district you have...
Miami-Dade County is the 4th largest school district.
Yes, it's in the top 10. So I had a chat with their RJ coordinator for the entire district. There's one. She had been, if memory serves, she had been trained by IRP, and so her job then for the entire district was to give 2 days of the IRP training to a team of like 4 or 5 from the school, and then she kept track of data. At the end of the conversation, she was like, so I think you sound busier than me.
Wow.
Because St. Paul Public Schools is not the same size as that, but to consistently sit in circle with your respective team, and then to try to be in the community as often as possible, to stay humble, to stay connected, to be sure that, like, our counterpoint, Twin Cities, has had a really different journey with restorative practices, and much harm came out of that.
Yeah.
And I can do any number of things with good intention, but it can land as a trigger and a reminder of harm to community circle keepers. It's done differently all over the place.
There's one thing that I particularly love about what you guys are doing, is that in the recent meeting we were sitting in, that you're tracking what's been the experience and what's working and how things are moving, but that's not informing necessarily the program from the program implementation perspective. It truly is an evaluation that, hey, we're going to do this
Yeah.
the best way we know how, and that's relational.
Yep.
And approaching it relationally, approaching it from a community perspective, approaching it from equity and inclusion, and just all of these big thoughts and ideals.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we'll figure it out on the back end of this. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
keep track of these things, and we'll figure that out at the end. But it's not this, let's do it by the book. And so, like, it's that intention, sort of, you're doing the work intentionally to not just do a program. It's this is we're really trying to be different.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, I have my own experiences with Miami-Dade County because that's home for me. Well, Broward County, which is the county next to it, but my wife used to work at Miami-Dade County, and I've even talked to the folks down there that actually got RJ to be finally be taken up by the county, and it's dark stories, of course. It's very interesting down there, and it is because they've taken it as a colonized practice, and they've taken it from that perspective of just using it to say they're doing something, not to shift and change ourselves from the ground up, from the inside out.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. I just have to give you kudos, because I definitely, you're honest about it. There's a tension.
Yes.
You started off by saying that there's a tension.
Yes.
And I don't think tension is bad, because it keeps us accountable. You say it with a smile. So I love that.
There's so much to be grateful for. Part of what the contract stipulated was that a school had to agree at a rate of at least 75% that they wanted to begin a restorative journey. There's very little in public education that is optional. There's just a lot. If you think about the social discipline window, a lot of things that are done to you. There is the language of with. When you add positionality and race and historical trauma and gender and orientation, with is complicated, and you really have to see it from an intersectional, like, whole justice matters kind of picture. So, I think it helps that I have an amazing evaluation BFF and Cara Beckman from the University of Minnesota, and from the very beginning we brought her and some other evaluators that were kind of supporting from the union side. We brought the evaluators into circle with everybody, and we processed in circle about what comes up for you when you think about being evaluated. When has evaluation served your heart, and when has evaluation felt crushing, and what feels vulnerable about it, and what's been a measure and mismeasure of you. And so the way our P leaders interact with Cara is deeply familiar, because they've sat in tons of circles with her.
I was going to say, I've sat, just from her presentation, like, I've met her, like, in meetings 3 times, and she gets it. And for me, I'm like, you're evaluating, but you get this work. Like, that was mind-blowing to me. Because I'm like, who are you, and where did you come from? Like, most time evaluators just come in and very cold. But, it's that intentionality again.
And now I'm sort of I feel like I'm an evaluation junkie. Like, St. Paul Public Schools is starting some really intentional work around social emotional learning. And my wondering is, okay, so what are we, if we're going to lean into Second Step as a curriculum that all the middle schoolers are going to get, what are we going to know at the end of 3 years? If a 6th grader started with this kind of social emotional literacy work at 8th grade, what does it look, sound, and feel like for them to own, name their personhood, for them to feel like a sense of agency? And my supervisor is very kind of like, we don't have the funding that Restorative Practices does, and that's a reality.
And there's thoughts in my mind on how that could be circumvented, I think, but
yes.
But it's amazing. The way I've always seen, and not just evaluation, and you could probably sort of relate to that. I'm gonna assume you can. I don't know, but I've always seen as it being a necessary part of our tools to be able to code switch into institutional language, into speaking the language that the decision makers, that the funders speak. Because, we could talk about, and you and I and circle keepers and people in the community, we could talk about all this hard work that we do, and we understand what we're doing, and we understand what's being done, and we understand where the gaps are and the shortcomings, and we see that. But it's amazing how when we relate this in our language to others, they often fall so short in understanding. So I've always, just growing up bilingual, like thinking about like what language do I need to speak in this situation. And even to take one step further, I remember my mother telling me, you know, I still remember it was middle school, and she let me have my first uncensored rap music tape, and she's like, I'm gonna let you have it, but don't let me catch you talking like that around the kids at home. I know you talk like that with your friends, and that's fine, but at home you're not gonna talk like that.
Yeah.
And so she added this extra layer to like, okay, well, I can speak English and Spanish at home, but now I have to speak this clean English.
Yeah.
And so like, she was very intentional in pushing me to understand that I can't interact with everybody the same way. I can be sincere and I can be myself and I can be authentic, but you speak to different people differently because you have to be mindful of who they are and what language it is that they speak. But I think you guys are balancing that out because it's like, you're serving as this bridge, right? Like bringing RP to people who don't know what RP is.
Sure.
And I mean, that could be the biggest decision. You know, if for anything, you know, that I think could be one of the biggest contributions to RP nationally, because now you're giving people like a blueprint. Like, hey, this is how we did it. You don't have to do it the same way, but look, this is what we learned. And I think that like you're telling the story of a community. Yeah. Like you literally are documenting the story of this journey. And you guys are gonna tell that story, and it's gonna be told. I mean, let's be honest, it's gonna be written into reports and presentations, and it's a story that's gonna be told again and again and again. Maybe in papers, maybe in practice, but that's phenomenal. Like that you guys are able to do that, right? Like as a practitioner, I love when we can share our world with people who don't know what it is about. And so, thank you.
I started holding circles with my babies.
Isn't it the best?
Yes, and because you have to, because otherwise talk about, there is no certification, and there is, like, is this really you? You can't, I don't feel permissions to be one way at work with a title that includes restorative and then come home and ground my children or take things away in an arbitrary, like, you know, based on my mood and how hangry I am in the moments. Like that, I was driving with my daughter, and she said something, you know, about another driver, because her father, I think, has a much more robust monologue when he drives with her. I was like, well, that wasn't the most restorative thing you could have said, Lily. And she was like, oh, Mom, stop it. Not everything has to be restorative. And that's outstanding that my 9-year-old can, you know, sort of peck at me and jab at me about, you know, not all things have to be restorative.
We're going to take a quick break here, and we'll be back with more Just Us right after this. We're back with more Just Us. If you're just joining us this week, I'm talking to Becky from St. Paul Public Schools, and we've kind of just been talking about this journey of not just your own personal journey, but it seems like the journey of a community, a restorative journey. And we left off at the end sort of talking about how your 9-year-old daughter took a jab at you about you don't have to be restorative all the time. And that's, absolutely, that's a position of privilege to be jabbed at like that.
Yes.
It's definitely, as a parent, it's not easy. But it also sort of leans us into our next question, our next sort of area, like, to be cheesy, the kids are our future, right? They're our tomorrow.
Yep.
Where do you see yourself in relation to restorative practices in general, but also where do you see restorative practices in the future?
I believe that because I've been gifted to sit in so many spaces in Circle, what felt really important early on was that I could, much like with my English classroom, I could put in every hour possible and every moment and every inkling of intent into the journey of restorative practices with St. Paul Public Schools. But if we are not deeply paying attention to the city of St. Paul and beyond that, our young people get off a school bus and are in their respective neighborhoods and their respective lives, and it's been really, really amazing to have partners like Sprockets who support all of our sort of out of school time and youth worker programs through professional development and evaluation supports as a partner from the very beginning. Happenstance, one of my childhood best friends, is the director of programs at Common Bond Housing. And so
they're the best. I love them.
Yes,
They're
I love
awesome.
them too. So I brought Jen to the 4-day circle training in Chicago when I went in year 1. And so to be able to sit in circle for 4 days with someone who's known you since you were 7 or 8, and who now has this remarkable role in an agency, an organization that I respect, and to think about how across their different residencies and properties, how restorative practices could take shape, because they have properties all over the Twin Cities and multiple states right now. How does this percolate out to think about it? I had a lovely chat with a gentleman who works for the city of St. Paul, and he supports the youth commissioners.
Okay.
And that was last year. And he said, so some of the young people, they want to do some work in restorative justice, and what they really want to focus on in their project. And of course, the project is the scope of, they have a year,
Okay.
right? And in a young person youth leadership program, you take like 3 months to figure out your topic. And then you've got the rest of the year to do it, but that's still like 5 months. And he says, so what they really want to do is they want to work on healing relationship between our St. Paul libraries and community and our park and rec centers and community.
Wow.
I was like, well, you know, that is visionary and beautiful, and yes, 1,000 yeses. And that's going to take a few years for us to do some of the preparatory work. And I'm laughing awkwardly, if only because it is so beautiful and it is so necessary, because I know our young people in our community enter those spaces, right, that are designed to be deeply accessible and welcoming and free and warm and providing. They're supposed to, right? That italicized thing of where they don't always hit the mark. And so if I have a young person or a community member then feel estranged from the library and feel estranged from Park and Rec,
Where do I go?
what am I supposed to do? That's a whole lot of adults in a whole lot of spaces across the city that first are really, really well deserving of understanding what is restorative practices and what is my relationship to harm. And
That's a hard pill to swallow.
holy buckets, it's a lot of stuff to imagine that a dysregulated, potentially dysregulated and hungry and cold person coming into a space is going to appear one kind of way, but your response to them has every potentiality to exacerbate their harm. And so what would it look like for you to count back from 10, as Nancy will say is a really foundational restorative agreement, to count back from 10 in that moment as opposed to saying you're out of here.
Yeah,
And beyond that, you're out of here for a week, you're out of here for 2 weeks.
absolutely.
So that nice conversation with I said, I would love to work with the young people on this, but
Let's be realistic.
the
In
timeline for that.
in a pragmatic way. When we do things, we should. I remember my father, in a non-restorative way, telling me, if you're going to do something, do it right. If not, don't do it at all. And I think we owe it. There's nothing wrong with, I don't mean it in a sort of, it comes off very condescending by me saying, let's be realistic. But what I mean to say is,
Yeah.
if we're going to do it, especially something that could be so groundbreaking,
Yes.
let's do it right. Let's do it intentionally. Let's do it slow. Let's
Please,
do it
please.
in the best way possible, because the outcomes can be so great.
Yes.
And so, so how'd that conversation go?
Well, he said, okay. After a long conversation, he was like, so that is probably more than they were anticipating, and that's cool. He said, so I need to go back to them because that's a much bigger thing. And so I think we're on an appropriate restorative pause, because while absolutely our young people hold us most authentically accountable to the stuff we need to reconcile and get our shit together on.
Oh yeah.
The weight can't and shouldn't be on them to repair adult-centered systemic issues. So the complexity of my job has been that if I'm paying attention, if I'm really, really paying attention, there's not enough, and I don't mean this with ego, there hasn't been enough me in the last 3 years. And so 60 to 70 hour weeks of the constancy of trying to pay attention.
Yeah.
And then the beauty of when I form a relationship in Circle, it is different than any other kind of relationship that I have formed with a human being, save my children, right? A handful of other people. And you want to tend to those. Now, thankfully, the folks that love me and who I love, that I've come to know and care for in Circle over the last 3 years, when I am in less frequent contact because of the intensity of things, they are kind. and they point out that they would like to see me and spend some time.
It's love. I just want to tell you that I got goose pimples because it's love though. Like I just think about my loved ones.
Yeah.
Months will pass and I don't talk.
Yeah.
But I could call them right now and we could have a conversation with no judgment. And so it's like the same way, like when the time comes for you to reconnect, it's like you want to reconnect, but there's no hard feelings for you guys for you being busy and them being busy.
Yeah. And we all want to matter.
Yeah.
Like, so that piece of making sure in the scope of that I am consistently cushioned by a paycheck every 2 weeks and health insurance and in everyday direction and commitment and purposefulness for restorative practices. There are many, many people in our community who I think would love the whole scope of their day to get to be about like, how does my restorative impulse get to play out today? And yet they have to do other kind of dumb stuff to pay bills or responsibilities. And so, you know, they want to be fed, they need to be fed too in all the ways that matter. Yeah, it's a piece of the story of like how to nurture circle relationships beyond circle with integrity.
Circle ends where circle begins. Circle begins where circle ends. Yeah, it keeps on going. It's I immediately envisioned the storytelling circle of it just expanding. It doesn't stop. Those relationships do keep going, and I could definitely agree with that. Yeah, some of the best relationships I have now are based from circle. That trust it's amazing the transformation that you can go through personally by sitting in a circle. And it's amazing, like the growth doesn't just happen there. May she rest in peace, Miss Alice Lynch. Yeah. That's who I sat with in circle for the first time. And it was her second to last, I think, or one of her last ones.
Yeah.
And I still remember, like, and from what I understood, like she rarely broke circle protocol, but she broke circle protocol and fussed me out in front of everybody. So that just gives you insight as to what a wreck I was. That day, I just came in with emotional stuff, and so like I was just acting a fool. Rightfully, like, and she rightfully put me in my place, but I say that I tell this like little mini story because it's funny. Like I always go back to these, you know, the times I've been able to sit in circle for extended periods of time, or even just a couple of hours, and out of nowhere, like you find a gem in there in that experience. You're like, oh, that's what I was supposed to learn from that, and like all of a sudden you find it, and you go back and it just keeps on giving you. So do you see yourself continuing down this journey of circle?
I think midway through year 2, I was able to articulate that one of my greatest responsibilities is to be both as giving and generous as possible to and with this journey, and also to be deeply unnecessary in the best way too.
Wow.
This has never, ever, ever been about me, and I consistently have to or need to gently, thoughtfully coach folks back from the restorative practices is fixing kids.
Wow.
Right? So it's not about me, and I'm not essential, and I have to be also honest too about these last 3 years have anchored that idea that I am someone's ancestor. And so, and I didn't say those words, somebody thoughtful, brilliant somewhere else said them, and I heard them, and it's true that if I'll be remembered, right, by a community, I want it to be in the sort of faintest, subtle, like cool breeze kind of way. Not because I hit anyone over the head with restorative practices. I don't go where I'm not invited. As a point of ethics from the very beginning, I don't invite myself to spaces. I don't cold call about restorative practices. Like I've got plenty to do in the spaces that are curious. And so there's a really curious like tension of, you know, last December a publisher reached out and said, so we want to put together a book about restorative practices, and I Googled and there was you, so what do you think? I was like, well, you're very funny, because literally at the same time Nancy Riestenberg and Mark Thorsbone, I think, were just putting out a new book, again, you know, Legacies, and then I think I was coming out of circles with Gwen and other members of the community who are saying, right, like there is a deep, deep, deep rift in inequity between those who have been published and those who haven't been published, right? So what do the people who have been published
let's be
look
honest,
like?
it's
Racially,
white people.
yep, it's white folks.
I mean, it's white people talking about,
yes,
hey, let's be more this and more that.
yes.
But where are the people of color being published, and where are the voices being brought up? Because the voices are there.
Yes.
We don't give voice to anybody.
Yes.
But the voices are there, but nobody's listening.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm coming out of like those intents and the International Restorative Justice Conference and just a whole bunch of like
that was a heck of an experience.
harm hitting its expiration date of like when, and I mean that in the sense that like how long do you hold harm, or how long do you sit with in your grace and love and agape humility for other people, whatnot, right? But it was there a clock had something had timed out, and so there were some folks of color who really wanted to say pointedly right about the harm in our community and the harm in the work and who was published and on and on. And so that I'm in this conversation and I'm like, oh gosh, wow, like maybe Becky, you've eked your way into holding some space, some newcomer space in the work. What does it even mean if you were to put something out? And so the chat with the editor, like I said, so I can't write a book about how to do it, and I can't write a book about being expert. I could write a bunch of like prompts, because I was an English teacher for a long time, about like what you might want to think about in terms of who you are and what your story is and what matters to you. And so they liked the idea of sort of a guided workbook journal, and so that's what I did. And so it'll be published this winter, and that feels terrifying and amazing, and then terrifying again.
Yeah.
Because it was interesting, like the opening outlines of what this book would be talked about like what is circle and the implementation science and the social discipline window, and all of that went away. There was a poet and a drummer at the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice Conference this summer in Colorado, and he had a t-shirt, and his expression that he espoused was "I am the work." And
Wow.
right, like when somebody says something and you're, oh yeah. So the beginning of this book is really like me composing an "I am the work" poem that has a bunch of different anaphoric phrases, and then Quinn, my son, composed an "I am the work" poem, and Lily composed her own "I am the work" poem, and a dear friend and restorative dude in St. Paul, Sean Stewart, he composed an "I am the work," and then they're gonna create just a bunch of sort of sentence stems with this idea of "I am the work," with the with the hope that there's also the "I am the work" in September, and "I am the work" before winter break, and "I am the work" when. And so it moves from that spirit of that this is a deeply personal thing to imagine restorative practices at school. It's filled with different stories of my life and stories of harm and coming of age, and it's filled with stories from St. Paul circle keepers and their stories in our schools as we've humbly been beginning. And so I don't know. I know that I feel an incredible gifted responsibility that I've been able to be in this journey for 3 years, and so I should try to tell that story as humbly and thoughtfully as possible in as many spaces as will have me.
I agree with that. I definitely
chit-chat
agree with
about
that.
the story.
I definitely agree with that.
So, and that means I need to sleep more. I need more vegetables and close the laptop more often. And so I think as long as I can embrace those habits, right? Like if I am good, wise, and powerful, right? And I gotta develop some habits so that I don't want to run from how magnificent and difficult this is.
It is. And I want to thank you for not not walking away from it. I want to just seriously thank you for the work you do, because seeing you do what you do and how you do it gives me hope. It just you give me hope. Sometimes we don't know what role we're supposed to be in, and we just kind of fall into it and just do the work that we're given, and that was the work that we were supposed to do. So I think your ancestors would look back and they would smile. I'm pretty confident of that. But I want to end this wonderful conversation with just a quick little reading, which came to mind as you were talking, and that's you have noticed that everything an Indian does in a circle, and that is because the power of the world always works in circles, and everything tries to be round. In the old days, all our power came to us from the sacred hoop of the nation, and so long as the hoop was unbroken, the people flourished. The flowering tree was the living center of the hoop, and the circle of four quarters nourished it. The east gave peace and light, the south gave warmth, the west gave rain, and the north with its cold and mighty wind gave strength and endurance. This knowledge came to us from the outer world with our religion. Everything the power of the world does is done in a circle. The sky is round, and I've heard that the earth is round like a ball, and so are all the stars. The wind in its greatest power whirls. Birds make their nests in circles, for theirs is the same religion as ours. The sun comes forth and goes down again in a circle. The moon does the same, and both are round. Even the seasons form a great circle, and they're changing, and always come back again to where they were. The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood, and so it is in everything where power moves. Our teepees were round like the nests of birds, and these were always set in a circle, the nation's hoop, a nest of many nests, where the Great Spirit meant for us to hatch our children. That was some writing by Black Elk. I just immediately had to take it there. Just reminded me of this particular piece. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
For your time, for your story, for just sharing this time and space.
Thank you for listening to Just Us. Please join us next time. Goodbye.